Today for math, we're talking about decimals again. And remember, decimals are parts of a whole, similar to fractions. So a decimal is anything that appears to the right of a decimal point. So a decimal point you're probably the most familiar with is seen in money. So it would be $2, and I'll even put the dollar sign there, $2, and let's do 35 cents. So that means two whole dollars, and 35 cents, 35 parts of a dollar. And we know a dollar is made up of 100 pennies. So if I were to say that as a decimal, I'm going to erase the dollar sign. It would be 2 and then I would just read the 35, and this is 35 100ths. So much like when we're reading numbers, when we were talking about whole numbers, if my number before was, let's do 643. This would be the ones place, and then I'd move over one to the left, and this would be the tens. Then I'd move over one more, and this would be the hundreds place. So up until this point, when we were talking about whole numbers, every time I moved over one place to the left, it was 10 times larger. So this is the ones, 10 times larger is the tens, 10 times larger than 10 is the hundreds place. So now I'm going to introduce this decimal, and I'm going to go in the opposite direction. So instead of every time I move over one place, let me put my 35 back in here, I'm going now to the right. So I'm going away from the decimal point, so it's getting smaller. So going to the right, this is the tenths. So this is 10 times smaller. And then I go to the next place, and this is called the hundredths place. So that's 100 times smaller. So every time I get further away to the right from that decimal, it's getting smaller in increments 10 times. Just like 10 times larger from the ones to the tens to the hundreds. This is to the tenths, T-E-N-T-H-S, not tens, tenths. Just like it would be 1/10. This would be 1/100th. And if I even went one more over here, this would be 1,000. So this would be the 1,000th place. So larger, smaller. Here's my decimal point. And every time I'm going to the right, it's fractional pieces or it's parts of the whole. If mine had just decimal point and a 1, some people would say 0.1, but we like to get away from that and say, I would read this as 1/10, 1/10. Because remember, I'm going to the right. So if that was money, that would be like 10 cents or 10 out of 100 cents, 1/10. If I add a 2 on, that 2 is in the hundredths place, but I would read it as 12 100ths. So when I'm going away from the decimal, the tenths place, the hundredths place. If I have my decimal point and I have no tens, but I have a 3 there, I would read that. That would be, if that was money, that would be like 3 cents. And 3 cents is 3 out of 100 pennies to make a whole. Or as a decimal, this decimal is read 3 100ths. Here's a decimal. There it is as a fraction, 3 100ths. if I put my 3 here, this is 3/10. I could add a 0 onto it, and now I have 30, but that's in the 100th place, so it's 30/100ths. But 3/10 we know is equal to 30/100ths because I could divide the top and the bottom each by 10, and I'd get back to 3/10. The 10ths place, the 100ths place. The further I go away to the right, the smaller it gets. So it's the opposite of our whole numbers that we've been working with. If I were to look at those decimals, I have no tenths, but I have a 1, and that 1 is in the 100ths place. So this decimal here is 1/100th. I have 1/10, I have no hundredths. So I could read that as 1/10 or 10/100ths because we know those are equal. So if I looked at both of these decimals, 1 out of 100 pieces or 10 out of 100 pieces, the larger would be the 10/100ths. So keep in mind, here's my decimal, and it keeps getting smaller and smaller. If I were to read this number, I would say my whole numbers first, which is 7. That's 7 wholes. And when we have the decimal, that's when we say and. So it's 7 and, then I read this. This is 45, and it happens to be in the 100th place. So this is 7 and 45/100ths. So I can read that as a mixed number, 7 wholes and 45/100ths. If this was money, it would be $7.45. 7 wholes and 45 parts of the 100. So I like to think when we're only in the tens and hundreds, it's much like money, the dimes and the pennies, the tens and the ones. Again, this is the 10ths place. This is the 100ths place. If I look at that decimal, I would read 22, and it's the 100ths place. 22/100ths. I put the 2 here. Now I have no tens, but I have 2 in 2 places away, the tenths, the hundredths. This decimal is read 2/100ths. So think of decimals as parts or fractions of the whole, the tenths place, the hundredths place. Just like if we're working with whole numbers, we have the ones, the tens, and the hundreds. It's all in increments of base 10. 10 times smaller, 10 times larger. Decimals are fractional pieces of a whole.